So I want to talk about the South Park episode Chinpokomon, and it's actually an episode that I really really like because this was one of the first episodes I actually watched of South Park back in the '90s. Um, the first episode I watched of South Park was Tom's rhinoplasty, where Mr. Garrison gets rhinoplasty, and I remember like watching that at my grandmother's house and kind of finding it funny. But also one of the early episodes I watched in the '90s was Chinpokomon, and obviously it is about the Pokemon craze and satirizing it. And I also like think that this is a great episode talking about Japanophobia or cultural phobias because that's kind of the main theme of it, but I think it really goes over a lot of people's heads unless you dissect it. So the boys are into Chimpokomon, and what happens through the episode is that it's kind of revealed that the Chimpokomon are trying to manipulate the boys or brainwash the boys into becoming into listening to the Japanese military and getting revenge for Pearl Harbor. And I think that one thing that happens through the entire episode, and I believe this episode won an Emmy, was nominated for an Emmy, is that they do a lot of like Japanese stereotypes, and the whole point of it is just to show the ignorance that parents have towards Japanese culture. Like obviously during the '90s, anime was becoming very very popular. Like Toonami on Adult Swim, you had Yu Yu Hakusho, you had Dragon Ball Z, you had Rurouni Kenshin. You had Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, Digimon, and a lot of other Japanese shows, Japanese anime. So I think the first thing that you see in the episode of South Park is Cartman's watching Chimpokomon, and you see him like his eyes go to the stereotypical slants that a lot of Japanese characters get in South Park and other shows. So it's kind of a reference to how some people watch these animes and kind of assume that when they watch like characters that are also like drawn in stereotypical ways, like Brock from Pokemon, like having slanted eyes, or you meet characters like Mr. Miyagi from the Karate Kid who are Japanese. Sometimes people look at like characters that they're inspired by, either animated or not animated, and kind of just assume that's how Asians are. Either they get a mental image that they all have slanted eyes, or you listen to Mr. Miyagi in his broken English and his very very eccentric sounding voice and very guttural voice, and assume that's all how Japanese people talk. And I think that's kind of what they're talking about there. And then later on in the episode, Cartman goes to the store and tries to steal Kenny's Chip Pokemon that he last grabbed. So that's kind of a reference to two things: that during the 1990s, Pokemon cards were very popular in school. Yes, there were fights. I remember my grandmother didn't want me to have Pokemon cards because she believed, because she read a story in the New York Times talking about like how one kid stabbed another kid over Pokemon cards. And I've known like, and it's kind of horrible because I've known like some stories where when I was in middle school, where some people would say like, if my teacher rips up my Pokemon cards or my father takes it away, I'll kill him or whatever. Like there was some violence over Pokemon cards, and like a violence like that was like kind of like, what, it's my thing, and you're not gonna fuck it up. And then one of the reasons because of that, a little bit of a tangent, is because Pokemon was a form of gambling. Because if you get a holographic Charizard, that's like a few $100s. And imagine like if you're a kid in middle school and you have a card that's worth a few $100s, you meet that friend that has a lot of like has a big allowance or whatever. They're giving you a few $100s, and you have like $400 or $500 in your pocket in like middle school, and it's a form of power. And I think that a lot of things that got underlooked in this episode, but what got underlooked in the Pokemon craze, was that it was a form of gambling. Holographic Charizard was like winning a $500 lottery card if that was the grand prize. The next thing that happens later on in the episode is the adults get concerned, and two things happen. There's a storyline where the toy store owner goes to Japan and he meets and he goes to the Japanese headquarters, and he kind of just doesn't know what the toy is saying. The same way when people heard Pokemon or other things or other Japanese shows, sometimes there'll be Japanese phrases or there'll be different Pokemon characters. There'll be people who don't know what's going on really. So it kind of talks about that, and then also the one of the characters in the store says, like, you know what, you have a very big penis, and then that's kind of like another thing too, is that it kind of is an allegory to how some people look at Japanese people or other cultures, so they don't get that, you know, when you look at anime, there's a rich, it comes from a rich culture of animation, and it's good that there's different types of storytelling that can inspire children to become better writers. But sometimes we're kind of like, it's different. Some parents could be like, you know, oh well, it's different, it's from an Asian culture. Don't we know Japan from stereotypes such as Japanese men have small penises, Asian women work at massage parlors, Asian women are very, very slutty and subservient to men. You know, because Asian women work in some massage parlors, stereotypes like Asian women will do anything for their husbands. They have infinite patience to do anything for their husband. And then other stereotypes, like you see later in the episode, which, such as, you know, the big one is that we only think about Japanese culture or Japan. The biggest contribution, the biggest thing that's ever talked about in high school about Japan is the bombing of Hiroshima. No, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then also Pearl Harbor. There's no like talking about Hokusai, the artist. There's no talking about imperialism in the 1880s. Like that's talked about, but there's not a lot of other things. There's a lot of famous Japanese writers. There's a lot of like stories about the camps that they had in California for Japanese American citizens. There's a lot of people talking about the discrimination that they dealt with being Asian American. The same way you read James Baldwin and other literature. Like, that's not really talked about that much in history books. That's overlooked. Some of it's not even in history books. It's more about Pearl Harbor, and then we dropped the atomic bomb on them. So I think that when Trey Parker and Matt Stone's talking about Hirohito, that's what they're talking about. It's like saying that, you know, it's this whole episode is about the ignorance that Americans have towards Japanese culture, the lack of education. And unfortunately, when you look at Pokemon craze, it really highlights how instead of celebrating Japanese culture, instead of like saying, okay, well, my kid likes Pokemon or anime, why don't I take them to a class where they learn Japanese? Why don't I take them to a Japanese history class? We kind of get to a point of getting afraid and stereotyping other cultures. I think that another great example would be like the Power Rangers. Like, obviously Power Rangers was a worldwide popular thing, so there could be a lot of people that that because some of it was done in America, that could have been inspired by American culture or whatever. You know what? There's other examples in history of like international stuff getting over in another culture. Like, you know, you look at Michael Jackson, like a black man getting over in other cultures in the 1980s. You know, there were some people in other cultures that didn't kind of understand, you know, a black man getting over. Like, they would look at Michael Jackson and say, like, okay, he represents all black people, a singer and a dancer. When actually, you know, you look at Michael Jackson more deeply, he was a very, very hard worker. He encouraged multiculturalism, and honestly, like, you know, his approach to embracing diversity was on the par of Martin Luther King. So, you know, he was an example in the 80s of something that is associated with stereotypes, African American entertainers, and he broke different barriers. The same way with Pokemon, it broke a lot of barriers to Western audiences understanding Japanese culture, and almost doing a revision of how people look at Japanese culture outside of what happened during World War II, mostly the atomic bomb and Pearl Harbor and Emperor Hirohito. And then also just challenging that, you know, the first barrier is overcoming the stereotypes, such as Japanese people are super intelligent, so therefore they can make Pokemon toys or Chinpokomon toys that have superior artificial intelligence to a point that they can manipulate our kids. The next thing is that Japanese men have small penises. The next thing is that you don't know what they're saying half the time because you don't really get their language. And then the other things that they're slanted eyes or they have a funny way of talking. So I think that when you look at all the stereotypes of that episode, with the end of the episode being about how the American parents think that their kids are being manipulated by the Japanese and other things like that, it's a totally huge allegory for parents not understanding the Pokemon culture and then extending that to not understanding Japanese culture and how this is actually a great thing to inspire your children to like one thing from another culture and then actually be educated and learn other things as well that are positive, like maybe different languages, different artists, different ways of storytelling and media. Because I'll tell you that one of the reasons why I liked anime in the 1990s is because a lot of American shows, like you look at something like Ed, Edd n Eddy outside of like the movie Powerpuff Girls and other things like that, you really didn't have a lot of shows with a lot of emotional depth. There's things like Batman, Rugrats, and other episodes. Some episodes of Rugrats with some emotional depth, or even Hey Arnold, and then you meet people like who are kind of saying that's too sad for children, that's too deep for children. Even though you're talking about representation, it's too deep for children. So a lot of times in American animation, you had so many times where you didn't have these deep, emotionally powerful stories. And then when you got, and then like things like Steven Universe, Adventure Time, Regular Show, those are examples of cartoons that was part of the second renaissance of Cartoon Network that actually was inspired by anime and the deep emotional storytelling, like caring about the characters, showing their struggles a little bit more and all that, versus something like SpongeBob where you don't have that, where it's American made, but SpongeBob's more inspired by American horror, versus actual anime or anything or deep telling characters. So anime's had a huge influence, and definitely like this episode of Chinpokomon being a huge allegory for Western culture not understanding Asian culture, or even like parents not understanding it, and sometimes parents and kids looking at Japanese culture and stereotyping it in the 90s because it was a new thing, it was a new invasion, and some people just not looking at it in the best eyes, given their limited education of different cultures. This episode's a huge allegory to that, and it's very, very well done. And if I'm correct that it won an Emmy or was nominated for Emmy, it was rightfully deserved.